Wow, you guys are such a great audience. I wish all my freshman seminars acted the same way. Thank you for being here tonight for a very special occasion. This is an opportunity to celebrate the Department of Philosophy and the impact that an alumni can have on the department. Now, many of you know that CSU has a distinctive tradition in philosophy in terms of the breadth of the areas of our faculty study, and also having pioneered areas such as environmental and animal ethics. Today, we're brought together by one of the more distinguished alumni of the philosophy department, Bruce Bodaken. Bruce is recently retired as president and chairman and CEO of the health insurance nonprofit Blue Shield of California. His long and successful career was groundbreaking in many ways, especially for his advocacy for universal health care in California more than 8 years before President Obama signed the Affordable Care Act. Through Bruce's generous support, the faculty in the Department of Philosophy have established the Bodaken Philosophy Symposium. Following tonight's inaugural event, the department plans to bring an annual series of lectures and workshops to the department. These will provide educational opportunities for both undergraduate and graduate students. As it becomes an annual event, the symposium will enhance the visibility of philosophy on the CSU campus and strengthen the reputation of the department and its faculty both nationally and internationally. So tonight I want to thank the faculty in the Department of Philosophy, especially Modi Gorin, Ken Shockley, and Phil Cafaro, who have been on the committee that has organized this, and John Didier, the chair of the department. I'd like to thank Mike LaPlante, who's the Associate Vice President for Development, who helped us connect with Bruce, and also the CLA Development Team and Communications teams led by Tanya Malik Carson and Beth Etter. Most of all, thanks, Bruce. Alumni like Bruce are very, very special. He has said to me on many occasions that his training in philosophy was central to his successful career, that his background in philosophy distinguished him from his peers with business degrees and uniquely prepared him to be a leader and an innovator. And now he is giving back to ensure that future generations have a similar opportunity to explore ideas and develop the skills that will help them in their future lives and careers as well. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Bodaken.
Well, thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. You're in for a treat. And I couldn't be happier that we're starting the lecture series here. And the ongoing series and workshops, I very much hope will expand both the reputation and the nature of the direction of the philosophy faculty. Philosophy here, as was said, changed my life. And went on, even though I didn't know I was going to have a business career. I ended up doing that, and it was incredibly beneficial to have learned both social and political philosophy, but certainly ethics, and an understanding of humane leadership. So I credit that to a very great extent to Colorado State University's philosophy department many, many years ago. With that, I also couldn't be more pleased to introduce our speaker. Dr. Ezekiel J. Emanuel is the Vice Provost for Global Initiatives, the Diane S. Levy and Robert M. Levy University Professor and Chair of the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. That's a mouthful, Zeke. I won't read the many accomplishments and publications. I will mention one thing. I looked up in Wikipedia, or I was told this, that Zeke is the most cited bioethicist in the nation, in the world, which tells you how much he's published and how well he's regarded. I will just say this, that during his days in the administration as health policy advisor to the White House in both crafting and then promoting its passage through Congress, the Affordable Care Act, I was at Blue Shield at the time, and as was mentioned, we took universal health care very seriously, and I got the distinct pleasure of both meeting Zeke and working a bit with him in that process. There was no one brighter, more practical, or more impactful in both the creation and the passage of that bill. I thank Zeke for that, and I now count him as friend, and I can't be more pleased that you're kicking off this series. Thanks, Zeke.
Sorry. Well, it's a great honor to be here, and I want to thank you all for showing up, and I want to thank Bruce for endowing this lectureship and having me come and give the inaugural lectureship. It really is a tremendous honor to be here. This is my first time in Fort Collins, and it seems like an amazing place, and as the philosophy faculty will tell you already, I've been trying to angle to figure out how I can come back and do some hiking. So I don't have that many years to go, so it's really urgent. Yes, 75. Hold on. Okay. Not far from here, I came up with the idea of talking about the American Immortal. You guys in Colorado know something about this. These are the people who think they're never going to die, who are outside all the time, who are trying the latest gamish to try to live longer, whether it's some pill or some other crazy idea. I happen to be related to one of those people, but I think that there's a very high concentration in a few cities in Colorado of these people, and I happen to meet them on occasion. But there is a version of the American Immortal who really doesn't want to die and will do almost anything not to die. Now, you know, the life expectancy in the United States has increased dramatically. At the turn of the 20th century, that is, in 1900, it was about 49 years. It then rapidly increased, and you can see here in 1960, it was 70 years, and we're now up at 79 years. You probably also will note that it's kind of plateauing here. We've actually had some pretty bad data recently about that. We are nowhere near the maximum country. That's Japan at 84 plus years. Now, a lot of people who release these data, the sort of life expectancy in the United States, every year the CDC releases what it is, and it's usually followed by some big articles, as if this were somehow an important number. I think this is a terrible number to keep track of. I may come back at the end and explain what I think is a better number. But I do think that when we're going to discuss longevity, life expectancy, immortality, we really have to ask ourselves the following question. Is it quantity of life or is it quality of life? So we can start now. I want everyone who believes it's quantity of life to raise their hand. Don't be embarrassed. You came to this because you don't agree with me, so you want to see what I have to say. Okay, raise your hands if you think it's quality of life. All right, I've won the discussion, as they say. We're now just quibbling about the date. And that's a very important point. By the way, if I had called the article Why I Want to Die at 85, no one would have read it. Okay? Let's just be clear. And by the way, for those of you who don't know anything about publishing articles in journals like The Atlantic, the author never chooses the title, and I did not choose that title. The editor chooses the title, and there's some email back and forth with a few expletives I can't mention here about that title. But there are people who actually do believe in the quantity of life, even if they're not in this auditorium. Probably the most infamous of which is Aubrey de Grey, British biomedical researcher. He claims that the first person who's ever going to live to 150 has already been born, and that the first person who lives to 1,000 will be born in the next 20 years. Now, whether you believe him or not, there are many people who, interestingly, don't happen to be located in Colorado, but they are concentrated in a particular place where there's a company funded by Google called Calico, which is looking into longevity. There's the Longevity Institute, there's the Buck Institute, and they're all trying to research how to live forever. I think 1,000 years is pretty close to forever for us mere mortals. So there are those people. And let's be honest, these are the books that are on the bestseller list in the United States at any one time. American Immortals, right? They're pushing for regenerative medicine, anything. And you can sell How to Live to 100. When I proposed to my publisher, my agent, maybe I ought to do a book out of my article, say, Americans don't read that book. They want to live to 100. You can't sell a book, why I want to live to 75 and that's it. Says a lot about the United States, right? 100, 100 is no longer good enough, 110, you just got to keep going up, right? That is people in this country who want quantity. There's a recent, I'll tell you, can I call them out? I'll call them out. There's a recent exchange. My brother organizes this sort of text, email exchange with people he knows. This is my famous Hollywood brother. And there was something in the news about living to 75, and I said, yeah, that's what I want to do. And Robert Kraft, who owns the New England Patriots, says, I want to live to 120. Classic. That's just classic of this attitude. So what's the rationale for wanting to live and worrying about quantity of life? Well, there is this view called the deprivation theory, which opposes Epicurus. This deprivation theory was originally developed by a philosopher who was at Princeton, is now at NYU, very famous, one of the giants, actually, of philosophy, Thomas Nagel. He wanted to try to think of the argument, why actually is death bad? It turns out to be harder than you would think. And it's harder than you would think because of Epicurus. So he put it this way: death is nothing to us, seeing that when we are, death is not come. And when death is come, we are not. It's nothing. For with the living, it's not, and the dead no longer exist. The wise man does not deprecate life, nor does he fear the cessation of life. So his basic argument is, look, when you're alive, you're not dead, so why worry about being dead? And when you're dead, you're not alive, and you can't worry about it anyway. So what's so bad about being dead? Turns out it's not so easy to answer that question. Go back and think about why it's bad to be dead, or why death is bad. He's not talking about the process of dying, he's talking about the being dead. You might think about that conundrum tonight. Well, Thomas Nagel tried to answer that question because he thought death is bad, right? And he thinks death is bad for those people who die, not for their relatives, not during the process, but actually being dead. He said, by living a shorter life, a person will inevitably miss out and therefore be deprived of valuable life experiences. Death is bad in what philosophers call a counterfactual way. It's not bad in itself. It's bad because we can imagine a life in which we'd have all these other experiences, and we're being deprived of those experiences. That's why we often think death is bad for an 80-year-old, but it's worse for a 40-year-old because a 40-year-old is missing 40 years of those experiences by being dead. So the best theory of why death is bad is a counterfactual theory. And if you think death is bad in this way because there's experiences, there really are an unlimited number of experiences we could have. And therefore, living to 1,000 is better than living to 80 or 100 or 120. The more life you have, the better it has to be because there are more experiences you will have. So thus, death is bad compared to having the life and experiences one would have had we been alive. Well, what kind of life might we actually have had we not died? Well, soon after I published my article in The Atlantic, very soon, like 3 or 4 weeks afterwards, someone ran this ad. 2 people, maybe about 75, with the tagline says, "When the view goes on forever, I feel like I can too. Go long." Right? They could be in Colorado, right? Hiking. This is why that's in America. Now, notice down at the bottom it says, "Look ahead to your future. Consider a Medicare supplemental health insurance plan." I won't tell you that that ad's paid for by AARP. All right? But this is the alternative to my view, which is, look, the view goes on forever. Life can go on forever. There's always more experiences. We can go hiking in the mountains. Remember to invite me back. I want to go hiking in the mountains, right? And about a month or 6 weeks, I think it was about 6 weeks after I published the article, the New York Times ran this. Maybe it was coincidence. Searching for the fountain of youth. So they went to various old people's retirement communities in Arizona, and you get this. Snorkeling. You get this. I don't know what that is, but it's supposed to look like vital. And you get this, you know, a 90-year-old on a very powerful motorbike. I want you to keep this in mind, because when people talk about the fountain of youth, they talk about living forever. This is what they really have in mind. And I want you to keep this in mind, because I'm going to argue this is not what we want. So proponents believe that living longer simply means living additional years of healthy life. Living longer will add more years. Somehow people think in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, and they'll go on then. That view that when you add more life, you're actually adding more, what? A little feedback. Oh, I'm sorry. Can we turn the mic on the podium off? Okay, great. So there was a theory developed in the early 1980s by one James F. Fries called the compression of morbidity theory. And the idea was that as we live longer, we're going to live healthier and healthier, and life's going to be more like the rectangularization of life. You live the same healthy life, and then you just fall off a cliff. Where do you think this theory came from? Stanford, you're right. The idea is that we're going to develop disabilities later, literally just minutes before we die, it sort of, that's it. And you can do everything. And this was a very credible academic theory developed out of Stanford and initially tested on Penn alumni in the early 1980s. And they said, yes, the longer Penn alumni live, you know, the healthier they're getting. And you get this to sort of bolster this view. This is obviously out of the New York Times, again, a few years after my article, Growing Older, Getting Happier. And it says that researchers contacted 1,546 people aged 21 to 99 via random telephone calls and found that the older age was not surprisingly tied to declines in tied to declines in physical and cognitive functioning, but it was also associated with higher levels of overall satisfaction. In point of fact, right, if you look at happiness curves, they all look like this, all right? Which is, you know, young people, they're really happy, and then something happens and it sort of drops. And then something else happens and they go back up, such that in the 80s, they're the happiest decade. Now, how do you explain this? There's a real simple explanation. It's called children. You know, you're dating, love life is great, then the children come out, all right? It goes down to the bottom. Children leave the house, happiness goes back up. You're laughing. This is absolutely true. The idea of the empty nest syndrome, where people are sad because their kids have left, is total bunk. This is what the happiness curves look like. And as a result, if you call people up, you find out that 80 plus is the happiest time of life. Really? What's missing from this picture? If you're a person like me who does a lot of surveys, you have to ask yourself, well, was that selection bias? Did we take an unrepresentative sample? Did AARP somehow, hoodwink us by this picture, right? So what is missing from that picture of Colorado? Maybe this. Oh, yes, when we think of living a long time, we don't think of this. Interesting. And when you, by the way, call up older people, you think you get these people to answer the phone? Selection bias, right? That happiness curve is probably bunk too. So there are approximately 46 million Americans over 65. This number projected to grow by double to 98 million by 2060, right? And today, we have 1 million people in assisted living homes. We have 1.7 million in nursing homes. We have 3.6 million who are bound to their homes and can't get out and can't participate in social activities, right? All of this stuff of, life's in front of us. We can go on motor scooters. We can go snorkeling, right? We can hike in the Colorado Rockies. Really? Well, let's talk about the true nature of old age for a second and think about what it's like. There are physical disabilities, mental disabilities, dementia, expansion of morbidity, not the compression of morbidity, and a decrease in our creativity. I'm just going to review the literature for you in a totally objective and unbiased way. You don't believe me? Well, 60.5% of adult Americans 65 and over have one basic action difficulty or complex activity limitation. These are things like walking up 10 stairs, walking a quarter mile without shortness of breath. 10.6% of adults 75 and over need help with personal care, bathing, feeding, going to the bathroom. That's just physical disabilities. We'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the expansion of morbidity, not the compression of morbidity. I also like to say that there's a whole slew of mental disabilities that are natural, normal, and I like to say no one gets smarter by getting very old, over 75. I know that's a hard truth, but it's actually true. People's cognitive function declines with age, albeit at different rates. We don't all decline at the same rate, but we know of normal brain aging, which means that the cognitive power we all have actually declines as we grow older. Certain things do improve with age. Very few, but there are certain things, such as crystallized intelligence, skills and knowledge that are overlearned that we do every day, like our vocabulary tends to stay the same, although many of us have word forgetfulness, or if you're men, you particularly have a problem of, it's called anomia. I can't remember her name, right? That's why you go out with your wife, so you can always remember the names. It's true women have less anomia than men, but in general, this crystallized knowledge of things which we've overlearned, we retain, which is why people, even when they have Alzheimer's, can remember things from way back when, because they've overlearned the stuff from 5 years old. But most cognitive skills actually decline as we grow older. I know this is painful. Believe me, it's painful to me, right? Our fluid knowledge, our problem solving and reasoning, that slows down. Our executive function, being able to plan, our ability to process information quickly, I don't know about you, but as a young kid, I used to have this ability. Now, we all know that multitasking is garbage, right? There's no such thing as multitasking. If you multitask, what you're doing is focusing on one thing, quickly switching to another, and then switching back. And as a kid, I used to be fantastic at that. I could read an article and have a conversation at the same time, and I was really, really good at it. Turns out, as I got older, I'm like really crappy. I can either read or have a conversation, but I cannot do both at the same time. And I find myself focusing only on the email or focusing on the conversation, but I cannot jump back and forth. That's brain processing speed just slowing down as you age. Attention span. Most of us older folks cannot focus and keep on task as long as people in their 20s and 30s. And a bunch of other things decline. Memory, acquisition declines across the lifespan. Our ability to remember things just goes down. That's why we can learn new languages at 4, 5, and 6, but not at 60 or 70. Episodic memory, memory for personally experienced events. The details of those events gets worse as we age. Working memory, this is probably the most important of all of it. That buffer that we have in our brain, hold information while we're manipulating that information to solve problems, for example, goes way down as we age, and that's why older people tend to be less good at problem solving than younger people. So this is just a conclusion quote from one of the articles looking at all these data. It says, processing speed refers to the speed with which cognitive activities are performed. This fluid ability begins to decline in the third decade of life and continues to decline throughout the lifespan. Many of the cognitive changes reported in healthy, older adults are the result of slower processing speeds. That's what normal aging looks like. Now, we don't all age exactly at the same rate. Some of us can retain more than others for a longer period of time, but it happens to all of us. Now, how does this mental decline happen? Well, it's a result of a decrease in the number of brain cells we have. They begin dying at 20 and continue. Neuron size and the number of connections between neurons goes down. So we have smaller neurons, and the connection between the neurons goes down. Those neurons which we've overlearned with, those connections stay because there are just more of them. White matter, that's what surrounds neurons, goes down. And plasticity, that's the ability of the brain, once you have an injury, to rewire itself. That continues. We all still have that ability, but it actually becomes less powerful. The plasticity, the ability to rewire the brain, goes down. It doesn't disappear, so all of us still have some ability. If you lose sight in one eye, you can adapt with the other, but it goes way down. So there's no doubt that our cognitive processing, our ability to manipulate information, declines as we age. And then this is, I think, there are a lot of scary graphs in life, and I often say this is, in my view, the scariest graph. I do think it's the scariest graph. This is a study of prevalence of dementia published in the British Medical Journal, and you can see all kinds of dementia, but this is Alzheimer's disease. Basically nothing, nothing, nothing. There are a few cases of, early dementia, premature dementia, but then 75 and whoop, going up to 30, 35% by 85. To some studies, it's 50% of the population by 85 have dementia. You go to Japan and you talk to their gerontologists, because Japan has the largest proportion of the population that is 100 years old of any country. There are as many 100-year-olds in Japan as there are in the United States, even though we're almost 3 times the size of Japan. You ask them, every 100-year-old is demented. Now, that's what they're physicians who care for this population. If you look at what the data suggests, this is the trajectory we're on for Alzheimer's disease. And, this is not burden-free. Probably most of you, there are more than 15 million Americans who provide unpaid care for people with Alzheimer's disease. Basically, 3 times the number of people with Alzheimer's disease get unpaid care in the United States. And it totals 18 billion hours in the United States alone for care. And then there's that compression of morbidity. Remember the idea that the longer we live, the healthier we would live. and disabilities would come later, such that we would really outrun the disabilities and they'd only happen at the end of life, this rectangularization of life. Well, this is the latest data on the so-called rectangularization of life. And if you look here at women, right, this is 1996, right? But this is what you end up with. It's moving in. More people with more disabilities. What are these disabilities? Ability to walk a quarter of a mile, as I mentioned, go up 10 stairs, do, I think it's 15 push-ups. Finally, there's what I call the age-related loss of creativity. Now, I have been accused of being an elitist, and I won't deny it. But the point of this is not to look at the famous and those who contribute. The point of this is we can easily assess creativity in those who have published literature and other things, right? It's harder to assess in other people, but there's no reason to think the creative class is different in terms of its decline. So let me just begin with my assertion. It's hard to name anyone in history who's made great contributions after age 75. Work on it. There was a book in the 50s published that went through all the famous people in history and looked at them and what age they stopped declining in participation. I have found 4 very incontrovertible examples. Goethe wrote Faust Part 2, like he was 82. Franklin's autobiography he wrote after he was 80. Verdi, who we're going to get to in a second, composed some operas after he was 80. Michelangelo continued to carve. And just today, someone who's trying to disprove and throw egg on my face noted to me that Sophocles wrote Oedipus at Colonna when he was 82 years old. And I said, I thought that proved my case. Very few people write after 75. If we can name them on one hand, even if we could name 100 times this number, across all of history, it proves my point. It's pretty rare. Go back home, think about it, right? I get a lot of people who call me up or email me who know me. Galileo, 2 new sciences. He was 73. This is Verdi. So be it. So let's do Falstaff. He was just reading Shakespeare. He loved the Shakespeare plays. He said, let's do Falstaff. For now, let's not think of obstacles, of age, of illnesses. What joy to be able to say to the public, here we are again, come and see us. Falstaff, his great opera, was first performed in 1893 when Verdi was 80 years old. It's a great example, but it's pretty singular. Find me another. So the list is very, very limited. And a limited list suggests contributions after 75 are super rare across all of history. You may come up with a few names. Come up with a few names. Doesn't disprove my point, which is creativity, productivity doesn't happen. Actually, if you review all the contributions in science, math, literature, music, where we can actually well document when people were doing things, it turns out that I'm right. So, little question for you Trivial Pursuits experts. What has been the oldest age of a Nobel Prize recipient? Anyone? Anyone? And in what field? Now we're getting hard. 90 years old, Leonid Hurwitz received the Nobel Prize in Economic Science in 2007 at age 90. Disproves Zeke. But the real question is, what age did he actually complete the work for which he got the Nobel Prize at 90? Sorry, it was 43. So, when do writers produce their greatest works of fiction and nonfiction, poetry? Turns out, 42.6 years of age, on average. Poets a little earlier, prose writers a little later. Remember this number. When do classical composers produce their greatest works? Age 40. And for those of you who remember, by the time Mozart was age 40, he was dead 5 years. right? 646 compositions, or 626 compositions, right? This idea that 40, 42, 43 is the age turns out not to be just a happenstance. It's also why, is the provost here, why universities tenure people round about 42, 43, right? I bet your average age of tenure here is about 43. Turns out there is a very consistent curve on creativity. It's true for the sciences, it's true for math, it's true for literature, it's true for music, it's true for art, it's true all across. If you look at age 20, someone typically starts their graduate work somewhere around here. They get productivity, annual productivity. You can measure it in papers, you can measure it in books, you can measure it in other outputs. And it goes up and peaks right around 40, 42, 43. There's slight variation in fields, not very much. And then it drops down, right, on the back end and basically stops. Not after 75. It just doesn't happen. This is very, very consistent. Now, obviously, there's noise all across here, right? Some people are going to be creative down here, just not a lot of them, right? Of course, these relationships are statistical averages across a population, right? There are going to be outliers. I've heard of lots of Aunt Millies, lots of them, fully competent at 95. I doubt it, but the fact is, of course there are going to be outliers. Some people remain active and creative into their 80s. For many years, I had a collaborator, one of the giants in health economics, actually one of the 3 original health economists, a man named Victor Fuchs, who's at Stanford. He's still alive. He's turned 94. I'm going to see him next month. He's still publishing papers. Every so often a paper comes out in JAMA, right? He's an outlier. And so, you know, it's possible, but it's pretty rare. There will be some people who will be outliers. By definition, outliers are rare. Those statistical things hold for most of us, and most of us can be expected to live in that statistical thing. And few of us are going to be outliers. Now, when you think of creativity, why is it that creativity stops at some point, call it 70, 75? Just think about how the brain is wired. You know, inside your head is basically survival of the fittest, right? That's how neurons work. The more you fire a neuron, the more connections it makes, right? And the stronger it becomes. And the less you fire some neurons, the weaker they become, they die off, those connections disappear. So by the time you get to 70, you've worn certain paths. Certain neurons are connected. And we don't rewire. We work on some similar things for a long period of time. We've worn that path. Hard to be creative once that path is well established. You've said everything you're going to say in that path. Now, again, there are some people. Ben Franklin is a great example. If you read his autobiography, or his biographies, that guy is just amazing. He dabbled in health. He dabbled in stoves. He dabbled in electricity. He dabbled in politics. He dabbled in publishing. The guy was very broad, right? He made lots of connections, which is, I'm sure, why he was able to remain creative into his 80s. Most of us aren't like that. We wear a path. We establish very firm connections, and that's it. So the true nature of old age, we have more physical disabilities, mental disabilities is natural aging, there's dementia after 75, expansion of morbidity, not contraction, and a decrease in creativity. Given this true nature of aging, how do we want to live? Well, all of you said it's quality of life. So I want to think about quality of life with you, and that's what the rest of this lecture is going to be about. You might not agree with me about 75, but I want to suggest it's a good number to keep in your head. So let me begin by saying that the true aim of life is not happiness in the usual hedonistic sense. Most of us, when we talk about happiness, think about, you know, drinking pina coladas on a beach with waves lapping at our feet. Right? the true aim of life is happiness, but in the Aristotelian sense. After all, I'm here as a part of the philosophy department. And I would say that more accurately, the true aim of life is meaningfulness. We want to make a meaningful contribution in our life. That's what really is going to give us happiness. And Aristotle said, by the way, happiness, you can be sure about whether you're going to have lived a happy life only at the very end at 75. But I would ask you, what makes life meaningful for you? All right? So I want to argue we shouldn't care about happiness. What counts as meaningfulness. And I would argue further that a life dominated by play, even if it's a happy life, is not a meaningful life. So I'm going to give you my little circle on the meaning of life. There are three things in life that make it meaningful. There's meaningful work, meaningful relationships, and play. And by play, I mean a broad list of avocational interests, religious interests, community interests, and other things. What I'm going to argue is that play is very important, but only in conjunction with meaningful work and meaningful relationships. When play comes to dominate too much of life, it's not meaningful anymore. So I think if you look at those three things, meaningful work, meaningful relationships, and play, there's a certain temporal tone to them. So if you take meaningful work, right? Goes up, we work for a while, and then it goes down, we retire, right? And not many of us do meaningful work after 75, after 70, right? If you think of relationships, right? Goes down because you have kids, then goes back up, right? Then it goes down again when your friends and other people begin to pass on, right? But remember, both meaningful work and meaningful relationships require intact cognitive functioning. Very hard to have meaningful relationships if you don't have intact cognitive functioning. Similarly, you can't have meaningful work without it. And then there's play, right? Probably goes down, kids, up and up and up, and it comes to dominate your life as meaningful work and meaningful relationships become less and less a focus. So I want to, as we age, meaningful work declines, meaningful relationships become more important, and play becomes more important. Meaningful work and relationships require intact cognitive functioning, as I just said. As we age, meaningful work and relationships become harder to maintain, just because our cognitive function is harder to maintain. Play naturally comes to occupy more and more of our time. At best, play is key when combined with work and relationships. Almost all of us know people who spend too much time at play, and they really have a vacuous life. When play is what life's all about. So I think about the meaning of life in this sort of temporal sequence. When we're young, there are vast open expanses. There are immeasurable opportunities. There are all sorts of possibilities. As we age, things get narrow. We tend to till our own garden, focus in a smaller realm. Our jobs, our relationships with our family. And then, as we age a little further, work stops becoming important. It's constrained. We spend a lot more time in front of the television. We do more limited things inside the house. And then ultimately it's dominated by crossword puzzles. I hate crossword puzzles. Crossword puzzles are the height of meaninglessness. They contribute nothing. They're self-contained. No one's better off for someone having completed a crossword puzzle or not. Part of that little photographic montage is to emphasize that we adapt and we accommodate to our declining cognitive and physical abilities. We begin to limit. We do less complex activities. We focus on ever simpler activities. We redefine our goals in life to be more and more and more constrained. From the big open expanse, to our garden, to our television set, to the crossword puzzle. And remember, this picture, Searching for the fountain of youth. What are these pictures of? They're purely pictures of play. They're not pictures of anything meaningful. Yes, someone can be vigorous at 80 and do whatever this is. It's meaningless. Literally meaningless. So as we age, we stop writing books and articles. That's the elitist in me. We stop speaking and organizing. We stop creating new furniture or clay figures or reconditioned motor scooters or whatever we're actually doing. We stop being active growers and creators of life. We get confined to more limited geographies. Some people can't even travel. My friend Victor Fuchs is homebound in California, and as he likes to tell me as a little joke, my psychiatrist tells me it's all in my body. That's right. So as we age, we end up watching TV, we read books, we listen to music, content ourselves with doing more crossword puzzles. We really become passive observers and bystanders of life, not active. As we age, we become consumers rather than producers, bystanders rather than actors. And I would suggest to you that part of the reason all of you raised your hand that it's about quality of life, I would want to urge you to think, is it about consuming life or is it about producing and creating and acting and being active and being in life, not watching it? So living longer doesn't mean getting another decade in your 30s. It means getting another decade in your 80s or 90s with cognitive decline, physical decline, dementia at risk. Do you want another decade as a consumer, observer, bystander, doing smaller and smaller things, contenting yourself because you've learned to adapt and accommodate to doing ever less in an ever more constrained environment? Do you want to live more years just to do more crossword puzzles? It's the ultimate question. I think Aristotle says this in the Ethics. So I would say live as fully as possible as a creator, grower, producer, shaper of life, right? And be content. That's quality of life. And that'll take you to about 75. Everything we know about physiology, brain function, cognitive function. I would say at 75, don't end your life. I'm against suicide and euthanasia. Right? I've long in the literature about it. But at 75, I would say stop taking your medical interventions to extend your life. So my own philosophy is no cancer screenings after 75, and by the way, they're not recommended anyway. No vaccines, stopping to take the statins. If you get cancer, no chemotherapy. I might still say yes to things like hip replacements to relieve pain, pain relief in general. Now, I was told that Leonard Cohen, the famous singer, right, took up smoking again. He waited to 80. He wanted that buzz, but what the hell? Who cares after 80, right? So I just want to leave you, if it's quantity of life versus quality of life, and all of you voted for quality of life, there wasn't a single person in this auditorium who had the guts to vote for quantity of life. All right, what makes your life meaningful? When is it enough? And when does it go and seep into, it's not the quality I wanted? And I would suggest that's not just about your physical decline. You ought to think about when your activities become more limited. And don't just accommodate to them. Don't just adapt to having more limited activities and limit your life goals. That is not how you want to live, or so I think. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? Now, I know I'm not popular in the audience, but if you would like to ask questions, I'm willing to defend myself.
We've got 2 microphones. My name is Moti Gorin. I'm a faculty member in philosophy, and my colleague Ashby Butner is over there. We will walk around and give you the mic if you have a question. I think we should, it's only fair to start with somebody who's, let's say, 75 or close to 75. So do we have any volunteers? Who has a question? Okay, let's open it up to all
It's
ages.
late at night, stunned into silence.
We're doing crossword puzzles.
Zeke, thanks for a great talk, really interesting. Obviously, this is very much an argument that depends on the empirical components. And when you read not just the futuristic literature about this kind of stuff, but serious medical researchers, they make claims about what we might be able to accomplish in the future regarding making those later years not just more years and more limited, but also either stopping or reversing some of these cognitive declines and physical declines that you've talked about. What do you have to say to that? I mean, if that comes to pass in various ways, wouldn't that change your message?
Let me just remind you, the last 8 drugs for Alzheimer's have all failed, right? Scientists, biomedicine, medical researchers are always, this is the golden age, we're just around the corner. That's their mantra. You can go back for a long time. Now, I think it's much more likely we're going to figure out how to rejuvenate bones so that we might not need hip replacements. We might be able to grow organs. Rewiring the brain, you know, I'm a little skeptical. It's a very complex organism, 100 billion neurons, excuse me. Yeah, you might be able to screw around with it, and you probably screw it up. So I would be a little skeptical. If it is true that we can get the brain to stay better, and you know, the compression of morbidity was the 1980s version of this, right? It's just around the corner. You can live longer, and you're going to live better, healthier life. It turns out not to be the case. Maybe I'd have to change my deadline. But I'm not, you know, I got a lot of human history on my side, and I'm not so sure that, you know, the fidelity with which we're going to rewire the brain is going to be sufficiently high enough. So, but I'm prepared to change my mind. I think at the end of my article in the Atlantic, I said that I was willing to have an open mind about it. I have taken on, by the way, anyone who's interested, I've taken on a number of bets that I'll change my view at 74.5. My kids are willing to take that bet too. They know something about me and my pig-headedness. So I just don't think so. I have a memorial service planned, by the way, for 74.5.
If I heard you correctly, you put religion, which I'm going to say is also spirituality, in the play section. And I was wondering what your thinking was in putting that in the play section.
So there are people for whom religion is very important. I actually go to services every week, and so I'm a practicing atheist. So I don't believe in God, but I do believe in going to service and being part of a religious community. I think it's very important, and you know, if that is, I put that kind of activity in meaningful relationships because it's a meaningful relationship for me. And you know, some people celebrate Easter, I'll celebrate Passover, and that's a very meaningful time for me. But I think you know, play is supposed to be everything besides meaningful work and meaningful relationships. That's just a placeholder. If you want to relabel it something, avocational interest, I think I said that inclusive of that. I just don't think when it dominates everything else, those avocational interests, that they're sufficient. And I think if you know people for whom that's the dominant thing, right? They've stopped to work. Maybe they sold their company for $60 million, and what they're doing is mostly avocational things, and they don't have meaningful contributions to others. Tends to be a pretty vacuous life.
Thank you for your talk. Please don't laugh in my face when I ask you this question.
It's all right.
But what do you think the chances are that computers may save us? For example, I no longer have to have the memory that I once had because I can access Google And so, what if we've got iWatches. What if we get to the point where we're going to be able to implant little computer chips in our brains? And, I mean, do you see that as any sort of, is that just a complete pipe dream? Or do you see that there might actually be some
it's an interesting
possibility?
question. What do you get out of Google? You get some facts, right? I hope you don't get interpretation. And I hope you don't get thinking, right? And just facts you need facts to think, but facts are insufficient. They might be necessary, but not sufficient. And I have to say that I'm always amazed by how much less my students actually know, especially know about history, that inhibits their ability to actually think. Yes, they rely on Google, but they actually don't know anything. Most of them don't know who Richard Nixon is. They don't know the Vietnam War, and they can't tell you when World War II started or ended. It's very hard to think critically if you don't have some of those facts stuck here and not on Google, because you have to make connections, you have to put things together. Just having the facts is not enough. Now, maybe there will be some brain implants that will enhance our memory, and our memory. If the key thing is, I try to stress here, and probably not enough of a neuroscientist to stress it accurately, but the key thing is not just the store of knowledge. The key thing is the processing ability and the ability to manipulate that information, and that dramatically declines with age, just does. Now, maybe they're going to have an attachment. I think this just goes back to the question here. Yeah, all right, if they have an attachment, none of our cognitive function declines. I'm just skeptical, Are you from California, by the way?
No, I have a son that lives in California.
Yeah, well, we all are infected by the disease.
But let me press the point just one step further. So, artificial intelligence, we see all of this, incredible advances in artificial intelligence. So, is there any chance that
there might be a chance that computers could take over, but I don't think that means that we're going to get smarter. Those are two different. No, and I think they're two different things.
Zeke, I've got the easiest question for you of the night.
Yeah.
How old are you?
What? How old?
How old are you?
I'm 60. Public information. 15 years to go. And my kids bought me this. There's this watch made in Sweden called the Death Watch. And it counts down. Ran out of batteries.
Zeke, can you share with us any stories or examples of stimulating pushback that you have read or heard in audiences when you've presented on this topic?
Oh, lots of them. They accuse me of being an elitist.
No, stimulating to you, something that you thought was...
Oh, yes. Okay, so
yeah.
I'll tell you the story. So when I wrote this article, I was telling it to some students today, I wrote this article because a very dear friend of mine is an editor at The Atlantic, and they were publishing something on the demographic shifts and more people old age, and he knew of my philosophy of 75 and out, and he said, you got to write this article. I said, listen, I'm finishing another book, and I've got all this other stuff. I can't do it. And he badgered me. So I said, you got a weekend. All you're going to get is a weekend. I'm going to sit down and try to write this thing. I've never, and I don't write that fast. I'm kind of a slow writer. So I banged this thing out, and I sent it to my kids, my youngest daughter especially is like the world's most brutal editor. So I sent it to her, and she said to me, before you publish this, you have to get your father's view, because you talk about him and the fact that he's slowed down and everything. And so I said, okay, I'll get his permission to include those, I think it's 2 or 3 paragraphs about him and his slowing down. And, I think just sad decline. So we were vacationing in Montana, and I said, Dad, tomorrow morning we're going to have breakfast together, just me and you, and I got to talk to you about something serious. So I we had breakfast, and I read him the passage, and he said, well, you're right, I've slowed down like that. I'm no longer what I used to be, but I don't agree with your philosophy of life. And he said, you know, I still like, he swims every day, he listens to classical music, he reads books, and he talks to his grandchildren. And he said, when you have grandchildren, that's the best argument I've heard. And I just had my first grandchild. I don't know exactly what it feels like because I haven't babysat. We already have a noun together, which is mischief. We're going to do mischiefs, and we'll see. But I'm skeptical that actually that's going to change my view, in part because I think, you know, I have a view or an image of my father, which, man, was like, I get my high energy, and my brothers get our high energy from him. It's just like running around, doing 1,000 things, and now he can barely walk across the stage, very slowed down. We just celebrated his 91st birthday, and he was great for about the first half hour, and then, you know, just the energy ran out. And I don't want to remember him that way, right? I'd rather him have lived a shorter life and remember him like the, you know, Energizer Bunny he was. And I do think it's very hard to remember someone, you know, what you remember is the closer, the more recent things. So you have to work at remembering the Energizer Bunny. And I think it's sad. And my dad and I, we disagree. You know, we've had a lot of arguments about it. So, yeah. Oh.
On that point, I would like to say that sometimes later in life, and maybe even during an illness like the one that my mother had, I learned about sides of her I never knew existed. There was this incredible sense of humor that erupted once that veneer, that social veneer was pulled.
It's called frontal lobe disinhibition. That's exactly what it's called. Yes. And they make a lot of very inappropriate jokes. I don't know. Yeah. My father's the same way, and I'm not sure I like it. And I'm being honest. I mean, you know, he was always a very funny man, and I'm not sure some of his jokes are ones. By the way, for those of you who are, you know, want to push back about this, let me just suggest to you there have been, you know, as I mentioned, Japan has, you know, the average age in Japan is 84. It's 5 years older than the United States. They have a lot more old people. And if you read about their lives, it is terribly depressing. There's no other word for it. Old women living alone, having no children around, you know, sometimes dying in their apartment. No one notices for days and weeks and weeks. No activities that give them meaning, no limited social interaction. It just, you know, we can add 5 years of life expectancy. Just doesn't seem to me to be worth it. So by the way, I showed you right at the start the sort of life expectancy curve. Seems to me that's a bad thing to measure. The thing we want to measure is what proportion of the population makes it to 75. And after that, we really shouldn't be counting. And that's a very different number. It means that what we really worry about is people who die at 65, people who die at 67, and we want to get everyone to 75. It's a very different philosophy than just extending the average life expectancy, as if extending the average will bring everyone up. That's not the way it works.
Dr. Emanuel, I'm calling you doctor because this is sort
right.
of a heavy question rather than
Okay.
Zeke, but what would you, as a doctor, what counsel would you give to an older person who said, you know, the real reason why I'm trying to perpetuate my life is because I'm afraid of death?
I'm a what?
I'm afraid of death. I fear death.
Yeah, well, I would read Epicurus. No, I'm being serious. I don't think there's anything after. I'm a non-believer. I don't think there's anything after. I think this is the life we have. You know, look, in a strange way, this article wasn't for those of us who are past 60. This article was for those of us who were 20, to try to suggest to them, you got to think about the end of your life when you want to plan your life. There are lots of things you can do in life that are not meaningful, that a whole career that's not meaningful. And you really don't want to be in a position when you're 60 and say, you know, or 50, and there's a lot of meaninglessness that happened before. So I'm less worried about someone who's afraid of death, and I'm more worried about people who are about to graduate from CSU and the kind of choices and paths they're going to go on. And that's really what this is a challenge for.
Zeke, thanks for taking my question. I'm a healthcare professional, and I find that physicians are terrible to talking about their patients about end of life.
Yeah.
Comments on that?
Yes. But I don't think it, so I'm an oncologist, and I started my career in the mid-1980s working on end-of-life care. I was one of the first 4 research groups working on end-of-life care to try to improve it in this country, because when I was a medical student, a third-year medical student, went around the wards and Boston hospitals and just, we're doing a crappy job here of caring for people who are clearly dying. I agree with you. But I don't think doctors in that regard are any more unique than the rest of the population, which is we're all scared about talking about this. It's something we don't know how to have a mature discussion about. And I think doctors find it very difficult to say to someone, look, I'm a cancer doctor, and believe me, it's difficult for me too, we've tried everything, and there's no more things I can do to throw at that cancer that are going to make a difference. We have to figure out, we have to plan your life a different way. It's very hard for us to say that. It's very hard for people, unless they've thought a lot about it all through their life, to accept that. You do, however, find a number of people, I find them in their 80s and 90s, who, they're okay with the way things, with dying now. And they've lived a full life. A lot of their friends have died over time, and, enough is enough. And you do see a lot of that attitude. Nonetheless, I think in general, and I don't think this is, by the way, there are a lot of people who make fun of Americans, I did call it the American Immortals, but I don't think it's all that unique for just to the United States. I do think that this is a problem for a lot of people in a lot of cultures, talking about death and how we ought to think about it and how we ought to orient our life to it. And if I'm honest with you, I don't know what it's going to be like when, when I'm on my deathbed. I don't know how afraid I'm going to be. I really don't. And I've thought about it more than probably anyone in this country. I think about it every day. I write about it. And it's like, I don't know. Is there another question? Yeah. About what? Yeah, it's a great book. What do I think about Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal? He's a very good friend, and I think it's a great book. We have slightly different views of the issue, but he and I are different people. I'm more provocative, and he's just a much better writer.
I appreciated your talk, and I agree with a whole lot of what you said. I'm an Aristotelian in my bones, and so and the curve of life is that way. I was walking in with a younger colleague. I'm in the philosophy department, and I said I was going to come. I had to hear this because I'm 76, and she said, "You're 76," and a lot of people will say that to you. I think they're just being nice, but in any case, when you are 70, you know it on the inside. Physically, I think you're right. Things are going, your memory, the names, all those kind of things are true. Having said that, Nozick says something in the Examined Life, and I just happened to read it a couple of months ago, in which he said about age in your early 70s, maybe you would get some projects that you might want to get onto. And I said, wow, that really happened to me. Okay, they've actually been growing since then. So here I am at 76, and I don't don't want to die. I want to keep as much of my brain power as I can and moving. Plus, I like your father's grandchildren argument, okay? And then I'm involved. I got service going on, and I've got the freedom to do it. So I want to say, I'm betting that when you get up into your early 70s, you may become more like me and do it. So
Well,
come back at me.
Okay. I haven't waited to my 70s. I have a lot of projects that I do. Every year, I've committed myself to doing something out of the box. I have to do something new. 3 years ago, I was a chef. I ran a restaurant for a couple of weekends. I don't recommend it as a lifestyle. It sucks. But it was fun. And I had the good and the great of Washington, D.C. come and eat my breakfast food, so it was fun. I've made a chocolate bar and from bean to bar and done everything necessary for it. I have a lot of projects. Those are great. They're fun. But they're play. They're not about meaningful activity. They're meaningful to me. I like them. But they're not about adding to the world. Yes, there's a chocolate bar out there. But I think I agree with you. I think having projects is really important. And I think getting involved is really important. Whether it's enough and whether you can sustain it enough, you know.
It's part of my work. I'm using philosophical.
Okay. Maybe you're one of those outliers. I don't know. I'll wait for the next article.
I raised my hand in response to the healthcare because I'm an ICU nurse. And I feel that, I personally feel that at age 75, you should no longer be given the option whether you are DNR or not. DNR stands for do not resuscitate.
I know what it stands for.
Well, not to you, but to... And because what are you bringing the people back to is really the question. And in response to the health care doctors, the answer is have the nurses talk to the patients.
Excuse me.
Other questions?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
What have you found in other cultures that have found ways to bring more meaningfulness into their lives as they age?
Well, you know, it's interesting. If you look at cultures, and actually if you look at people who live a long time, it turns out that the secret is community. It's being associated with a lot of other people, caring for them, having them care about you, too. You know, I don't know how many of you know this book, The Blue Zones, but it's about, 6 places around the earth: Okinawa, Loma Linda, Sardinia, someplace in Greece, where people live an extraordinarily long time. They're not exercise nuts. They do eat, mostly a plant-based, but they almost all are omnivores. They eat meat and fish and other things. But what turns out is, they live in a community. They have meals with other people, and having those not just meaningful family relationships, but larger extended communal relationships are really important. Let's just face it, the United States has always been bad at that. Okay? It's just a matter of fact. A huge proportion of our population moves every year. It's actually gone down in recent years, but until about the last 20 years, America was the mobility place, breaking up communities. We used to send kids to local public schools, maybe still do in Fort Collins, but lots of big cities, that's not true anymore. So those arrangements where you lived in a, community where you had a lot of acquaintances, people who you actually knew, you lived with, you shared meals with, that's very, very important. We have less and less of it, and I don't think it's just true in the United States. It turns out, yes, they still have more of it in, say, smaller Scandinavian countries or other places, but almost every big industrialized country, it's gone down, and look at Europe. Mobility is all over. And it makes it hard to have those kind of communities for extended periods of time. But those are very fundamentally essential for human beings. So.
So, you mentioned you were opposed to euthanasia and suicide assisted? I was wondering why.
It's a whole nother lecture. I mean, it really is. So I'll give you the 4 quick arguments, and then you'll have to read more. 1, your idea of who wants euthanasia and assisted suicide is not that person who wants it. Your idea is some person with cancer writhing in pain turns out to be false. Almost all those people are people who worry about loss of autonomy, loss of dignity. Most people who select euthanasia are actually pain-free, and it's not about pain. It's about psychological distress, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. I don't think that's a good answer for that. That's the first thing. The second thing is, if you look at, if you think about euthanasia or assisted suicide as a sort of answer to the problem of we do a very bad job of caring for people who are dying, and the answer is we'll improve it by euthanasia and assisted suicide, that's also wrong. Even in Oregon, only 0.3% of the people who die by assisted suicide there. And it's been legal for 18 years or so there. It's just not, there are 99.7% of the population for whom it's irrelevant, and if you want to improve end-of-life care, you got to focus on the big numbers, not the small numbers. Third, most people think it's quick, painless, and flawless. Turns out all of those are true. There's no medical intervention that's quick, painless, and flawless. Right? They're just, even a simple blood draw is not quick, painless, and flawless. All of them have problems. Assisted suicide and euthanasia, we know from early studies that they've had problems. It's actually quite poorly documented, but the Dutch who've done the best show that patients often can't swallow the pills. You can't find a vein. They wake up. They don't actually die. They have prolonged comas for days and days and days, and either die then after 4 or 5 days or don't die. So, the idea that this is a quick, painless, flawless way is just factually incorrect. And the last point I would make is, people say that there's no slippery slope. I do think that the more it's present, the more it's used. The more it's used, the more it's used on cases which we agree are not the cases we would have permitted had we agreed to it, right? Cases of people who are depressed, cases of people who can't consent, children, etc. In Belgium, they've taken away the lower bounds of age. It used to be 12. Anyone above 12 could get euthanasia. Now they've just taken it away. So for all those 4 reasons, I don't want it legalized. And I've had that view for 25 years. And it's ironic, most of the people who are in palliative care and end-of-life care share that view. We can do better.
Over here.
Sorry.
First of all, I agree with everything
what?
You've said. I watched my mother die. I watched my father die from long-term illnesses, etc. I also have a husband who's in healthcare, and I hear about the screening colonoscopy on a 90-year-old.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I wanted to, and he's done mission trips around the world, and in the hospitals, the families have to bring meals to the patients. The families have to bring food and bathe them and take care of them.
Yeah.
And they go home to the families after they leave the hospital. And we don't do that here. The medical industry keeps taking care of the people and prescribing and doing. And I think the number is about 85% of our medical expenditures go to people over 75 years of age. And do you think all of that would change if families actually became more responsible for their elderly?
First of all, that 85% over 75 is not true. It's a big proportion. As you get older, the wheels start falling off and you need health care. So it is a big proportion, but it's not anywhere near 85%. Families do a lot of caregiving. I think one of the great untold truths about it is People get a lot of caregiving from their families already because our long-term care provision is pretty sucky in this country. And it turns out, if you look at the data, 75% of family caregivers are women. Daughters, spouses, daughter-in-laws, and so it's a disproportionate weight on women. So I think more caregiving would actually disadvantage women more. Being the father of 3 daughters, I think that's a bad idea.
The two-part, whoa. I agree with a lot of what you're saying, primarily for the cost. You know, I don't like to see resources going to somebody who's 75 years old, so I would do what you suggested. However, I'm unclear on whether you were saying that the meaning that like your father gets, or the meaningfulness that that these people in the blue zones are getting from their community. Are you saying that you don't think, in your opinion, that their view of what's meaningful to them works for you, and therefore it's bad because you don't agree with that it's meaningful to them? I just want to be clear before I went around and told everybody that's what you thought. And secondly, at the end, you said really this article was aimed more at the young graduates, like a 20-year-old.
I didn't understand the last bit.
My mic's not working anymore. That you said that primarily the article was aimed at younger people who are getting ready to graduate. So I wasn't clear what the message is. Is it just to go out and live healthy, and then when you're 75?
Okay.
I wasn't quite clear what that message is to them.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take the
But the relationships interested me.
Let's take the first question.
Yeah, it sounded like you were...
I'm not someone who believes that each of us chooses our own life and we don't have to justify it to other people. I do think that there are better and worse ways of living life, and those are objective, that they're not... I think there are multiple good ways of living life, but I don't think... but part of what I want to do is to contrast a better way of living life and a worse way of living life. And part of what I want to object to is what is called in the literature, and what I pointed out to, the sort of adaptation and accommodation to the more constrained view of life, limiting our goals of life, limiting our objectives so that we're content with crossword puzzles. Obviously, crossword puzzles is a metaphor for very limited range of things that we're doing. And I do think, you know, I've had this argument with my father. It is not meaningful what he thinks is fulfilling. And I think he can only think it's fulfilling because he has reduced his purview in what's acceptable, whether because of limitations physically or the fact that he's scared shitless of death or whatever it is. Right? I do think he has accommodated, and part of what I'm arguing is we should not accommodate. We should, throughout our life, have bigger goals for what we want to accomplish, and we should stick to those bigger goals. And being satisfied with watching TV and doing crossword puzzles is not part of it. So being creative, huh?
What should he do at that age, though, if that's what he has?
There's lots of medicines he could stop taking. And that's true for almost all of us. It's going to be true for all of us. We're very hard to get to 75 without taking any medicines and without being kept alive one way or another. It's interesting. People say, all right, I agree with you, no chemotherapy. All right, I agree with you, I'll stop taking my statins. And when I said, I'm not going to take any antibiotics, oh, well, that's the limit. I don't know. Why is that different? Because it's cheap? I don't know. I'm not persuaded. So 20-year-olds, what's the message to 20-year-olds? I think the message to 20-year-olds is, you got about 55 years. Think really well about how you want to spend those 55 years.
Okay, so we're just about out of time, but we have 2 people who've been waiting patiently. So you have a question, and you're going to have the last question, and we're going to have to call it an evening.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of tap your other expertise. You talk about what proportion getting to 75 is what you want to look at.
Yeah.
Okay. How does universal health care fit into that? And might some of those dips in the 40s and 50s be due to the fact that we don't have a good health care system? And what do you think it's going to take to get there?
That really is a whole nother lecture. Well, I don't know how to start answering that question. It's, first of all, I don't think the dips and bumps I don't think are fundamentally about healthcare, because healthcare contributes, whatever, 10 or 20% to our longevity. There's a lot of other things that go into it. Exactly what they are, they fall under the social determinants of health, social mobility kind of factors. So, if you were going to press me, yes, we do need universal health care coverage in this country. Why we don't have it? Well, we've got a lot of ideological divides in the country, and we've built up a sort of inefficient system. We've got to get the system to be dramatically more efficient so we can free up some money, part of which would go to universal coverage. I really do think that's a fundamental issue. Here I am at CSU, and I was told 7-8% of the budget of CSU is given by the state of Colorado, and it's been going down, no surprise, because it's been going down in every state in the country, and the main reason is, Medicaid costs and costs for state worker health insurance and costs for uncovered people have been going up, consuming ever larger proportions of state budgets. And that trade-off, you may not draw that line, but that line is drawn by budgeteers in state capitals. Medicaid goes up and up and up. You can't raise taxes to pay for it. They've restricted enrollment by and large, and the consequence is you can cut certain things. State budgets don't have that much to cut. Primary, secondary education, higher education, correction facilities, highways, that's the big issues, right? Turns out that cutting higher education is the easiest thing to do. It's the most invisible. You can always raise tuitions until people scream. And so, one of the reasons I personally have spent a lot of time focused on trying to control healthcare costs, redesign the system to be more efficient, is because I actually care about education. And the only way you're going to get money shifted over to education is by making sure healthcare doesn't consume more and more and more. So that's not the answer you wanted, but that's the answer I could give. Without giving a whole nother lecture.
I wanted to get back to the medical industrial complex and the way that the money moves in this country, and the fact that you need a heck of a lot of savings to pay if you want someone to stay at home and be taken care of at home, or you trade it for your own income, you leave your jobs and so forth. Do people even actually understand how much it's going to take, and the fact that there are the demographics for people who can care for the elderly are simply not there in this country? So just your take on that.
Just imagine if you were China, and I'm being totally serious. In the United States, we still have more than one kid per family. In China, you have one daughter or daughter-in-law for 4 adults. That's a real demographic disaster happening. We're a little better than that, but I agree. We have, I think I said in response to some question flippantly, we don't have a long-term care policy, and we don't have a solution to the long-term care policy. It turns out to be enormously expensive anytime you look at it. We did have a part in the Affordable Care Act for long-term voluntary insurance, and had to be repealed because we could not certify that it was fiscally sustainable. To make it sustainable, you'd have to have everyone contribute into the system. Now, if you think it's hard to persuade a 25-year-old to buy health insurance, try to persuade a 25-year-old that they're going to need long-term care insurance when they're 65. Not likely to happen, and they don't have that kind of purview. So that's why we have a problem with the long-term care situation. It's also why we end up sending people to institutions, and institutions are enormously expensive, disproportionately expensive for what they do. If you just look at the trends going forward, we're going through, the healthcare system is going through a very steady process of deinstitutionalization. Fewer hospital days, fewer skilled nursing facility days, fewer rehabilitation days, because those are just too expensive. So more care is going to have to be delivered at home, and we're going to have to figure out how to do that. So on that happy note, thank you very much.
I do want to make one quick announcement. Thank you, Zeke, for a provocative talk. The Bodaken Symposium will continue in the fall. Our theme next year is economic inequality. We'll be having workshops in the fall, and another distinguished speaker next spring semester. So keep your eye out for emails. They're distributed across campus for that. Thanks again, everyone, and thanks, Dr. Emanuel.